Hello there, and this is Cult Classic Theater, and I'm your host, Conor McKenzie, and tonight we're going to be talking about a really cool, ghoulish horror film by the name of Night of the Living Dead. So this film is directed by one of America's first blue-collar filmmakers of the post-counterculture movement, George A. Romero. This is his masterpiece. This 1968 film takes place during, that time period, the late 60s. And we find ourselves in a graveyard with two characters. One is Barbara and her boyfriend Steve. And Steve is trying to scare Barbara about the ghouls and saying, "They're coming to get you, Barbara." That is when we learn that there is a zombie apocalypse soon to be underway, or flesh eaters, as they were called, or in the film. The film plays on our fear of the unknown and what we cannot comprehend. So, unlike previous zombie horror films of the 1950s or 60s or prior eras, there is no voodoo or hocus pocus or satanic magic or demons that come to life. They just rise from the grave. So we don't get an explanation. We don't get the normal explanation of a parasite or some type of disease caused these people to become flesh-eating monsters. They're just zombies. So the film, expertly by George A. Romero, uses Dutch angles, very well lit lighting, especially for a low-budget film such as this. It uses the type of ambiance and horror that you would expect from Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho or Rear Window. Night of the Living Dead is very influential because it's technically the first picture in American history. It is the first time the word zombie, not the first time the word zombie is used, but is the film that popularized the zombie genre. The first time it popularized the zombie genre. Unlike many films today, the Night of the Living Dead not only popularized the zombie genre, but it expanded the way Americans thought about this type of monster. For example, zombies in prior films to this were usually henchmen or lackeys to Satan or voodoo, witch doctors, offensive stereotype to African Americans, of course, during the late 50s. Where Night of the Living Dead is concerned, they are just the living dead. They are just unknown flesh-eating beasts that want to consume flesh. So you can play with the metaphors, as George Romero does. And George Romero has a very poignant message in this film. This film came out in 1968. We had just had the assassination of JFK a few years prior, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated during this year. So the film has the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And that's where our character Ben, who is played that is where our character excuse me. That is where our character Ben, played by Duncan Jones, comes into the forefront. Ben is an African-American man trying to escape the zombie apocalypse and is shacked up in this small little hut, or house, I should say, with Barbara and a few of the survivors. And the film really plays on claustrophobia and the feeling of paranoia, especially for Ben's character, because he's an African-American man, and he's not played as a stereotype like Step and Fetch It or used as a way to demean him. He's a man who happens to be African-American who is trying to survive this dystopia known as the apocalypse, while he's also confronted with racism, because he's confronted by racism in a few regards. There is also Carl Hardman, who is played perfectly as Harry, who's one of the survivors in the house, who is a bigot, or a bigot for the 1960s. He's apprehensive of Ben's character, Duncan Jones, because he fears that this black man is a threat because he's black. Of course, this is unfounded and, of course, racist and xenophobic. However, the film does a great job of playing on that fear, the fear of the unknown and the fear of man, because slowly as the film progresses, it becomes more and more dark and depressing, because we see our three main characters, Barbara, Ben, and Harry, become more and more dehumanized. More and more they grow to be inhuman and cruel and very almost animal-like is the word. Now, of course, Ben less so. He keeps his humanity because he's the only one who's trying to think logically, but the other two are, including Ben, are growing more and more paranoid as the proceedings go on. So George Romero is remembered fondly for this film because it's such a guerrilla filmmaking style. This film didn't use permits. It was filmed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's not a Hollywood film. It also predates the countercultural revolution, such as Easy Rider with Dennis Hopper's directorial debut. It predates the cultural revolution like Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, which came out in 1969. So the film really opens a new kind of way of filming something, because the film doesn't have big stars like, Glenn Campbell, John Wayne at the time, James Gardner, Jack Palance. It's a film about people, regular people like you and me. And that's what really builds the horror and the suspense, because we don't have an easy character. And what an easy character or a good protagonist isn't in this film is there isn't a movie star. There isn't a Leo DiCaprio. There isn't a Will Smith. It's just three people trying to survive the apocalypse and hoping that they have the ability to not kill each other. So it's very well done. It also is a great film because it's a boiler film. Now, what's a boiler film? A basement. And we have our two opposing views, usually in a boiler room. We have Ben, who's our hero, an African-American trying to survive the 1960s in the post-apocalyptic world of zombies. We have Harry, who is the closeted bigot who fears Ben for an irrational reason, only because of the color of his skin. Yet Harry does not ever use racial slurs or says some terrible derogatory term. So we have these two opposing forces in one room. And the idea is that we have Harry, who believes he's a hero in his heart, but yet is just as monstrous, if not more monstrous, than the zombies outside. We have Ben, who is trying to be just a normal human being or a good person who just wants to escape or survive this terrible night. So this is what the boiler room does. As the night goes on, just like these two little puppets here, the characters get closer and closer to conflict until finally they explode. They both end up trying to either kill each other, or one kills the other, or vice versa. The reason why this is usually done, it's usually for dramatic effect, because we now have human conflict other than just the outside of the zombies. Now, also in the boiler room, you have, say, like the audience, Barbara. Barbara stands in between these two, opposing forces. Barbara is like the middleman, or middle woman, I should say. And her job is basically to be the voice of reason between these two extremes. And that is really what the film does so well by George Romero, is get into the psychology of the human mind. The irrational fears of man and his hatred towards the things he does not understand. Also the heroicness of trying to help those in need. So you get the best of both in this film. Now, Night of the Living Dead is also remembered fondly by many of its fans because it was the first film in America, for the most part, to have a non-rating. Now, what's a non-rating? It's basically essentially like a R rating today. But instead of getting an R or an X, which came later in the 70s, it basically meant that the studios won't, the studio system will not brand your film as appropriate for film viewing. So this led to George Romero going to local theaters and purchasing time and places for his film to be shown. This really helped out actually in the long run because Night of the Living Dead grossed way more than its actual budget, which was a mere, I think, $5 million at the time for inflation. And the film, what George does so well with this is it's simple, it's brutal. That's another thing. That's what I was getting at with the non-rating. This film has actual gore. And this is why it scared so many people at the time, including famous horror author and icon of horror, Stephen King. Stephen King even said this was the scariest movie he'd ever seen because up until that point, most films, especially in the 60s and early 60s and late 60s, there wasn't a lot of blood. There was no gore. There was no extreme violence. You didn't see these type of films until the late 70s or early 80s. So you get a feeling that if you were there in the late 60s in the drive-in, that your girlfriend or you might even throw up or have panic attacks because you had never seen something so violent, visceral, and just, as Roger Ebert said, so disgusting, as he would put it. And this helped in its favor because all the teenagers during the late 60s and early 50s always went to the drive-in, so they all went, and it became one of the first teenage blockbusters, if you will. Now, Night of the Living Dead also really helped build a genre because it used the fears and the atmosphere to its advantage. Instead of films like slasher films like Freddy, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th with Jason, the film in Night of the Living Dead is much more quiet. There isn't a lot of loud music or score, practically no score because of the budget. There's just you and these people and the sound of the undead hitting the walls. So it begins to really become a cacophonous sound of darkness, and it plays on that paranoia. The closest to this film in modern times is The Thing, directed by another horror alum and sort of underground filmmaker until he blew up with his 1978 classic Halloween, John Carpenter, used the same type of material for his film The Thing, which is the claustrophobia and the Dutch angles and the feeling that you don't know who to trust would be the undoing of the characters instead of the monster hunting the hero. So we have that. We also have what many films try to do, but this film does perfectly and exceptionally, is Night of the Living Dead does have sort of a political message. Now, George Romero, to this day, even after his death, says there was no political message in the film. But because he picked the best man for the job, which was Ben Duncan Jones, who's African American, and he is unceremoniously killed by rednecks and the local police officers thinking he's a zombie and throwing him on a fire, or a funeral pyre, as you would say, it really evokes the horrible images of the civil rights movement and the fight for equality in America, and the fear of white America fearing the growing belief that African Americans could have rights. And it really it really captures that horror, because the pictures at the end of Night of the Living Dead are these rednecks and police officers holding up our hero and our very, very good actor, Duncan Jones Ben, like he's a trophy. And this, of course, goes back to slavery days and so on and so forth. So it really hits home for the audience, and it actually makes them think about how maybe they have perpetuated this event and how it transpired. And the film also, for the first time, for a B movie, Night of the Living Dead uses special effects. Now, of course, it's not CGI or VFX like we have today, but they were special nonetheless. So we have the zombies, and instead of zombies looking rotted and defleshed or their skin melting off like we usually get, Night of the Living Dead was more simple. Most of the zombies just had green makeup, which ended up looking gray on black and white, and they would walk around, and they were extras. And even though they didn't have the rotting flesh of our contemporary zombies, they were scary nonetheless because of the trick that George Romero did. Unlike today, where they will use fake flesh or meat for the scenes when the zombies are ravaging something or eating someone, in George's film, because he had very little money to none, he used actual cow meat and flesh. So this made the audience who were in attendance of the film very disgusted, because you're actually watching people consume meat and steak and flesh, even though it is fake because it's not real people. It is still meat, and cow meat, I should say. So because of that, it gives it this visceral reaction, because you're watching people consume, and it becomes very dark and depressing. Another thing that works in its favor is, due to the film being black and white, it kind of glosses over some of its flaws, like lighting or camera angles. Because the film's in black and white, you don't notice it as much. Now, if you watch this film in one of its lesser forms in color, it loses the tension, because in color you can see that it's bright and shiny, or that it almost feels like George Romero was purposely trying to make Night of the Living Dead, with it being black and white because that's all he could afford, it is a throwback to Frankenstein and Dracula and the original Universal monsters, like Boris Karloff in Frankenstein, or Dracula, and it really plays on that. It plays on that human quality that many horror films seem to neglect. Also, later on, this film of our also, Night of the Living Dead is one of the most influential zombie films because it is a zombie film. It's one of the first films that really places the zombies at the forefront instead of the background or a side character. This helped create the zombie craze once George Romero got more funding after this for his next film, Night of the Living Dead. Oh, I'm sorry. Dawn of the... This helped create... This film, Night of the Living Dead, helped create George Miller's universe of zombie films. For example, he made his second picture, which was Dawn of the Dead. And
you said George Miller instead of George Romero.
oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. A zombie craze in America with its intense violence and the idea that zombies could be scary and having them be a swarm, unlike other films where they're just one or two undead characters. It really gave it this hive mentality. Also, the idea in this film, which is two rules actually come from this film that every zombie film would play with or take from. One, you could shoot a zombie in the head and they would instantly die, which has been used throughout video games, movies, and pop culture. Two, that the zombies, if they bite you or you get infected somehow, you become one of them. And that is one of the great horrific fears of this film that it plays on, because for those who watched it during that time period, they could see the zombies as two different ways of looking at it. Many people from the East Coast or California saw it as a indictment on capitalism and the consumer and the eating of our own people and flesh, while many people in the middle of the country felt more that the zombies represented outside fears of infiltration, like the Soviet Union, communism, the USSR, China, other more outwardly threats. So both had their view of the zombies, and neither are wrong, because the zombies can be anybody or anything. That's why they're so scary. And because Night of the Living Dead created almost a zombie, I wouldn't even say renaissance, it created it's the magnum opus for zombie films, like the Holy Bible of it. George Romero ushered in what we think not only are zombies, but also created his own universe. For example, after this film did so well, he made a second film called Dawn of the Dead, which is a very well done film, and it's set in a mall with zombies. And if you've heard that premise before, you have, because it was not only the original 1976 film, but also the 2004 film, directed by Zack Snyder of Justice League, and James Gunn was the writer, who you famously know as the man who gave us Guardians of the Galaxy. So George Romero has very much a big following in that. And with Dawn of the Dead, he also played on consumerism, like I said, what many hippies took from this first film, and expanded on it in Dawn of the Dead. And that's really what he kind of did throughout his career. He would take zombies and use them in a way to address political issues or fears during each decade. So Night of the Living Dead is the civil rights movement. Dawn of the Dead is the 70s, so it's consumerism. And then Day of the Dead is the 1980s and the Reaganism and Reaganomics and the fear of the wealthy elite becoming more powerful and the lesser classes growing more and more inept. So we have that, and et cetera, et cetera. So he really built that, and I don't think any director has ever perfected that in a way, because he did it, especially those his first trilogy of those Day of the Dead films. He did not make it so that the film was about those messaging. Now, they were in the film, but they were never at the forefront, or they never took the audience, say, who might disagree with some of the messaging to heart. It was basically, if you got it, you got it. If you didn't, you didn't. But it was a good overall entertainment of a film, entertaining. This leads me into my next point. George Romero helped build the career of one of special effects artists extraordinaire, Tom Savini, who would later, after this film's success, work on Dawn of the Dead. And he helped build what the Americans and fans of horror all around the world know as zombies, because Tom Savini was a gore expert, as he called it, and he worked on films such as Friday the 13th, The Prowler, such films as Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. So he worked on a lot of films, and he still does today. And he really helped build the blocks for what you think of as the undead, the flesh, like we just talked about, the flesh melting off, the blood, the guts, the idea of for humans. And that really came through with George and Tom's get-together. He was a gaffer on this film. He didn't get to work directly with George, but you see how friendships work. They build on each other. Another thing that George Miller really pioneered too was the idea of a blue-collar filmmaker. Now, what do I mean by that? A blue-collar filmmaker is what George is. George Romero didn't come from Hollywood, wasn't a big shot, wasn't a another way of looking at it. He wasn't a Spielberg or a wasn't a Spielberg or George Lucas. He didn't move the camera. He didn't play with all the different things. He was very much a stationary director, and he really focused more on not what the story was or what the script was or anything, actually, because there wasn't really any script in this for this film or his next film, Dawn of the Dead. But really, George felt the best way to get something on film was to edit. He was a big proponent of editing. And you see it in his films. He can very well splice and cut better than most filmmakers in Hollywood at the time. And this is due to the fact that George knew he didn't have a great script or famous actors or a big budget. So he had to work with the idea of cutting corners. So he cuts out any images, or cuts in, I should say, disgusting images like a dead cow's head or anything like that, to get the audience to go, oh, ow, ooh, ooh, ee, always keeping them on their toes so that they're not bored or overstimulated, but at least in the mood for a film. And another reason why I call him, and the reason why I call him a blue-collar filmmaker too, is that he wasn't an insider. He was an outsider. He never really became a big influence in the industry that he wanted to be in. Now, yes, he made his Dawn of the Dead trilogy, of course, and other films afterwards, but he never got into the mainstream. He never became like his two, not rivals, but two younger filmmakers who would, which is Wes Craven with The Last House on the Left and Nightmare on Elm Street, and Scream, which are big franchises. Everybody knows their names, and everybody knows those horror characters, and etc. Also, he didn't reach the heights of John Carpenter, who we just talked about earlier, who made Halloween, The Thing, and a few other and Escape from New York with Kurt Russell. So because of that, George Miller was in this weird in-between spot where he was famous enough to get zombie films made, but he was never famous enough to get what films he wanted to make. I know, like his counterpart, John Carpenter, and you see this in a lot of their films, George Miller was a very big proponent of Westerns. He loved Western films just like John Carpenter did. And you can see this in a lot of their characters. A lot of their villains or heroes have sort of Western type themes. Doesn't mean they're overtly cowboys or they act like yeehaw, but they have usually the semblance of a Western character. Like the Man with No Name, played by Clint Eastwood in the Dollars trilogy. There's usually a character like our protagonist in this film, Ben, who we don't find out his name till almost the last half of the film, really plays on that, which is we don't know who our hero is. And that actually helps the horror because Ben doesn't become a hero until almost the second half of the film. So we get this fear of who do we trust, who's there to look out for us. And Romero's counting on that. He's also counting on, which is another where he got the idea, and everyone has stolen this, one of the first directors to ever do the boiler room in a big motion picture, and he said this helped him with Night of the Living Dead, is Stagecoach, directed by infamously John Ford. And in that film, it's about a couple of characters on a stagecoach, literally. And that's what he basically used the template for that film, but just put it in a house with zombies. And it works the same way because even though we don't know these people, we do. Because George Miller, just like John Ford, uses what we like to call in the business archetypes or stereotypes, depending.
Somehow pulling on the mic now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To pull it out, adjust it, and try not to, I don't know what you're doing to hit it, but if you keep
I'm sorry about that. I might have moved too much. I'm sorry.
Yeah, might be where, hold on, where is the mic located?
It's right on the middle of my shirt.
No, the box itself.
Oh, it's right in my pocket.
Put it on your lap.
Okay.
Put it on your lap and close your legs, right?
Okay. Yep.
And then just restart that. And then, by the way, you should probably think about wrapping it up after you make your point because you're at 34 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
So, John Ford literally used a stagecoach, and George Romero used a house. And what both these men did expertly, by the way, and especially Romero, was taking archetypes or stereotypes in some cases, like John Ford did, and flipping them. You know, instead of the African American being, say, a criminal or a step-and-fetch-it character, he is a actual good human being. The woman in this is a damsel in distress until she becomes a zombie, Barbara. So that gives us a big, oh my God, heel turn. And that is what Romero does so well, is taking a simple concept and blowing it up to the big screen and giving us a entertaining yet terrifying story about survival, trust, love, and even hate in some cases with the character of Harry. And I think it's very much well deserved to be seen on the big screen or wherever you can. I want to thank everyone here in the studio, and this is Cult Classic Theater. Hope to see you next time. Take care.